So this is what I'm going to be talking about. And my name is Remy Siu. I'm the creative director at 1000xRESIST Studios. Amongst some other things that I do there, I founded the studio in 2021, kind of mid-pandemic. And before then, I spent about 10 years working in the experimental performing arts, where I had a background in music composition and new media arts. So we just released our debut game, 1000xRESIST. Thanks. And I'm just going to play a very quick trailer so that everybody can kind of get caught up to speed what it might be like. Is the audio okay? Good, because hopefully it's not too loud.
Tell me, Watcher, is there a feeling worth getting incinerated over?
Love your mother and trust in her teachings. Do your duties and carry out your function for a future far from sin or incineration. We're all just flowers in a garden of her making. Soon we'll grow beautiful enough to be worth taking. The All-Mother, she shines so bright, but Mother's glow is not as warm as it had seemed to be, and it feels very far from me, and it feels very far from me.
Thank you. I just put this slide here because, like, hopefully as I go into the process of making it, and you might think that I'm a little out of my mind about it, that players did enjoy it. I'm really relieved. And so, you know, the overview of the game is that it's very much a narrative adventure game. There's no fail states. There's very light puzzles, and it's extremely story forward. It's in the genre of science fiction, magical realism, has multiple perspectives and control schemes. So it's like first person, third person, fixed camera, top down, stuff like this. And we also explore generational trauma and specifically our stories and other stories of Hong Kong diaspora. And we made it in about 2 years and 11 months. I should just say 3 years. I've been saying this. It's like $2.99. It's 3 years pretty much. And our process is we really actively subtracted as much as possible to kind of make space for ourselves as writers to work in. And so we really had no combat, no items, removed as many kind of things that we thought was necessary to make a game as possible. And we were very inspired by Kentucky Route Zero in this respect. And we also really tried to align gameplay with the narrative as much as possible so that one of the rules for us as writers is that what you're doing in the game has to kind of really make sense in the narrative, which was sometimes very difficult. We also had a very hyper-focused goal, which was to make a narrative game that no one else would, and that's the key term, make. And we would do this by trying to really lean into our strengths, using our background in the experimental performing arts and kind of extrapolating our processes into video games and finding out, I guess. So what are the kind of processes that we practiced, at least here in Vancouver locally? A lot of experimental performing arts undertake something called the devised processes. You may have heard them as either devised theater, devised dance, devised performance. I'm just going to read this Wikipedia explanation to you, largely because I had some video picked out for it, but it was maybe not suitable for public. So Yes, devised theater, frequently called collective creation, is a method of theater making in which the script and performance score originates from the collaborative, often improvisatory work by a performing ensemble. And the ensemble is typically made up of actors, but it could be of anybody. It could be the lighting designer, it could be the costume designer, it could be anybody. And in this case, they collaborate, and you could have visual artists, composers, and choreographers as well. And often they don't have to be professionals either. Sometimes it's very interesting to have in the room when you're devising somebody who's just a hardcore hobbyist of something else that, that might be interesting. So, the spirit of devised performance or devised processes is that we really try to look at who is in the room right now. So like we could technically make a performance here all together with however many people are here, and try to understand the constraints of everybody in the room and do something together. I put a disclaimer up, is that this is just how we did it. I'm just gonna kind of run it down, but if there's something interesting in here, feel free to steal it. But I also say it's like devised processes sometimes is very much playing with fire. It was very specific to this game, and I often wonder how transferable it is because we do have a lot of practice failing at it in the theater. So we were confident to do it here. Because devised processes are often chaotic by nature, and they're very easy to get lost in, especially when you're in the middle of something. And they also resist straightforward documentation, can take a long time. And somehow, no matter what you do, it's always really, really, really hard. So I know that's not a hard sell, but it does create the unexpected. And I find that one of the reasons why I got interested in devised theater in the first place is that I saw that it allows gestures to transform organically throughout the work and allows for exploration of thematics in really playful ways. And a lot of the processes that we undertake really require us to create specificity inside of the work so that we could talk about it and that we can understand it. So I'm going to say how we do it, and I would say that this is something that is practiced very differently by many different performance groups, so it's not like a recipe. One of the first things we do is establish a common vocabulary amongst all the practitioners and a shorthand, and that actually takes quite a long time. And we really want to embrace the locality in the room, look at everybody who is participating in the room and understand their strengths and weaknesses and foreground their kind of lived experiences with the goal of really trying to create something that would not be made outside of the fact that these constellations of peoples are in the room together. We would embrace all of these things, but very specifically the unknown and emergent inside of doing it. And for us, we really like to react to our own work. And this often requires us to forget the plan and embrace immediately what is happening right now. And what is usually happening right now is that we get playtest returns and we get feedback, and we need to understand what we made as opposed to what we thought we made. From a writing perspective, we don't hire writers to execute a specific style that's predefined. We really want to embrace the kind of different styles of writing that are present in the room and desires in the room. We also, as I said before, who is in the room really matters. So if you remove that one person, the entire work is going to change. So we kind of settled on something which we, I guess, called the devised writer's room, which is some horrible mutation of a TV writer's room process. And it did kind of look like we were arranged with 3 writers and with a Unity journalist. That was myself. We largely had no experience writing for games. But we did have very different backgrounds. And we did have a lot of experience working together in the performing arts, which I think was important. So where we usually start is that we do themes first. And largely because at this point, we don't even have an understanding of what the plot is. We don't understand what the characters are. We're really just generating from themes that are interesting to us as humans in the room. And we spend a lot of time just getting it all together, understanding it from it at as many angles as possible. And we kind of circle it and circle it and circle it until we feel like we're okay. We have a common understanding of it. And then we try to beat out the entire game multiple times until we feel like something is okay. this is funny because this chronology is something that we had at the very beginning of the game. It's completely out of date because what we decided or what we found out is that we threw it all out. We do all this work to prepare ourselves and ground it together. And then we kind of have a common understanding of what desires that we may have as practitioners. And then we want to embrace the unknown and emergent because we know that any time that we start to write a word, something will start to change, something will be discovered, and we want to embrace that. So I guess in performance here locally, amongst the community, something we usually say is hold on tightly, let go loosely. And that's how we would start kind of constructing a chapter for the game. There's 10 chapters in our game, and it would involve kind of pitches, hot drafts, rewrites, implement an engine, more rewrites, voice record, and then even more rewrites. And we would undertake this kind of one chapter at a time, which comes back to us kind of allowing ourselves to let the work inform itself and not to think too far ahead, because usually where we end up in an affect place for the player is not usually ever what we think or plan for it to happen before. So I can go down each one of these. What we learned in pitching it is that at first we were trying to pitch scenes or different lore bits, and that really didn't work because the moment we did that, we found it very difficult to kind of work around in engine. So we started to realize that when we're working in the writer's room and we're pitching, we have to pitch spaces, especially if they're existing, control schemes, at least for this game, and structures about how to organize the chapter from a compositional level, and then genres and scenarios. Specific to this game, we also really wanted to continue to use standing sets and really think of the game as almost kind of like a 90s television show where there are standing sets that are reoccurring, and so that you can be really ruthless in your storytelling if it actually does not require you to exert too much effort to try something. So then we would move on to hot drafts, where writers would go off with a general idea of the chapter, and they would just write whatever comes to them, write whatever conversations that they're interested in writing in the scenario. And really, we did this because we found that if we mapped out the narrative beats too finely for any specific chapter or any specific sequence, when the writer would go to work, they would have nothing left to discover, and the air was kind of taken out of the room. So we wanted to avoid doing this. So we would just go straight to hot drafts where people would just get their thoughts on paper as quickly as they can in a kind of dialogue scenario. And really to embrace all of these things. And usually writers, at least the writers in our writer's room, would get bored very easily, and they would come back and they would be like, I'm bored. And we would largely have to kind of understand why. And often we found the discovery was that maybe what we're doing at this particular moment is rote. Maybe something feels like not exactly exciting to us. And so maybe we need to break the structure. Maybe we need to make some more interesting decisions. And so once we get all these hot drafts, we start kind of arranging them and understanding what they are, how they may fit together in some sort of constellation. And it's a pretty brutal process for hot drafts because here's an example where one section of the game, we have 35 conversations written, but we cut 30 of them and we really only keep 5. This is an extreme example. So then we would take those surviving hot drafts and then we would go and rewrite them and review them. And usually it's always somebody that's not you. Another writer would do this. And this is where we would try to adapt into lore and world rules and chronology. And of course, just make sure, it's moving along in a brisk pace. From there, I guess my role as the Unity generalist was to check with the writers, like, can this actually be done? Like, is this something that's not easy to do, but like achievable or feasible? And then I would go to the programmer and ask some of these things, like, does it involve new assets? Is it actually worth it? And if it can be rewritten to fit existing resources that we have, that is always better. And so if it didn't, we would have to cut it or like largely change it or throw it out. But really the biggest part of the rewrites is to ask ourselves, especially in the game, are we making the most dramatic choice at this particular moment? And if we aren't, why, and why are we waiting for it? And so sometimes this can have some pretty generative results where if we made a more dramatic choice, it makes things more interesting for the writers. And then the writers actually work faster and they can start to elaborate on things that they didn't think and start to move at a quicker pace, as opposed to have this constant feeling of waiting for dropping a beat or something like this. It also forces you to think on your feet, which is something we like to do. On the other end of this, sometimes we get unexpected outcomes. We would put together a chapter and then we would send it to play testing, and we would have an unexpected outcome of a chapter hitting a specific way that we didn't intend and we didn't know. So we're careful not to work too far ahead so that we understand what that affect and result is. And then we have to adapt to it because otherwise we would, I don't know, it would be bad, I guess. So in this really extreme scenario, it led to a very major thing happening that we didn't anticipate for, or plan for, or know for while we were making the chapter before. So the writer has a lot of agency during this process, at least we're at our studio, because we're such a narrative-driven studio. They're pitching, they're writing dialogue, they're rewriting, and then specifically they're going to direct the line of dialogue that they write, which I think is really important. And then they review the work in Engine. And so this is something that was really interesting for us because this was our first, I mean, of course we had director performance before, but this was our first game or first game ever, I guess, where we had to deal with so much voiceover that as we wrote and recorded every chapter as we were going and making the game, the writers were getting better at writing dialogue for the performers because they were understanding better what the performers were, how they were taking a character and maybe being surprised by their approach as well. So usually we say the first direction to a performer is no direction, so that it gives them space to surprise us. And if we are surprised by them and it's interesting, we try to run with it and maybe find a different angle or a different kind of layer for the scene that we did not anticipate. And if we do this enough times, I guess it starts to compound and we start to get to a place where we just better understand all of these things more intuitively, and it kind of rolls. And this is very much also devised processes. You really don't understand the process that you're undertaking until a little bit through it, and then you start to roll with it, and then you start to adapt it. And yeah, so this is more takeaways for us on our side, is that I think themes first is really important because if we didn't do that, we would really not understand the kind of constraint or decisions that we were making. Like, why are we making the decisions that we are? And if we're being ruthless, we don't want to be ruthless for the sake of being ruthless in the narrative. We want to understand how that relates to our themes. Again, if you're bored writing it, probably the player's bored reading it or experiencing it. That's just what I believe. So we really want to embrace discovery in the writing process for the writer and give them the kind of agency to really steer the game in ways that are unanticipated. So, and the other aspect is to lean into the writers that you have in the room so that you can create something that wouldn't be possible without those specific people inside the room. And to surprise yourself and be surprised by others. And finally, one last time to say that devised processes are playing with fire. You can't easily get lost in them. But I think one thing to foreground is always a degree of spontaneity that gives a work energy or gives process energy, because I personally really believe that if there's energy in the process, the player will feel that energy on the other side of it. And it's very difficult to quantify or understand that without undertaking the process. So that's a very short overview of kind of what we did in the writer's room of 1000xRESIST. And so I open it to questions.
Hi there. Thanks for your presentation. Question more generally about writing in games, but maybe your specific case could speak to something a bit deeper. When you are like in the midst of your development cycle, do you recommend or do you reckon that you'd be writing concurrently with the rest of your developers while they're working on other stuff? Or would you be considering like certain mechanics or certain assets that they're making to be blocked until certain parts of the narrative are more fleshed out?
Can you say that last part again? I just want to make sure I 100% am grabbing that. Yeah.
So would you be having your writers, like you guys, and like your your artists, your programmers working on stuff concurrently? I imagine you would be. Or would you be considering like some of your level assets or some art assets or animations or what have you to be blocked until you can finish the writing aspects?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So again, this is not something that I'm actively recommending other people to do, but like we did write it concurrently to production. And one of the ways that we managed it was that there was a little bit of an upfront cost on the writer's side. So we would start with the writers first. So the writers would be about one chapter ahead. And then we would try to glean as much information as possible forward, but not really lock that in. So then from an art pipeline perspective, they were getting an understanding of what characters needed to be made and what environments needed to be made. And sometimes I would have to say no to the writers and be like, hey, no, our art pipeline's kind of like locked up. They're working on the things that we had asked them to work on. And so we can't do this thing that you're pitching because we don't have capacity for it. So yeah, I mean, there is always that is one of the difficulties of trying to do this concurrently, is that you can end up in a situation, and we did end up in a situation like this at certain times, where the artist may be blocked because there has not been a writing decision that's made. But definitely to actively think about that and mitigate it as much as possible. I don't know if that answers your question, but we're just trying to dovetail our understanding of what is required and what is being currently worked on at any given time, so that the writers are still ahead of everybody else in regards to understanding of the game, and try to keep that kind of dovetail happening throughout production.
Gotcha, thank you.
Left over here.
Hey, Remy.
Hi.
Thanks a lot, pal. Super interesting. Curious about how your budgeting approach looked like for voiceover, given there was endless rewrites, or not endless, but
yes.
potentially
Yes.
great rewrites folding steel.
Yeah, well, we don't record until actually, it happened very differently.
I say this because, like, as the person often advising developers, like, when to record voiceover, we're like, don't record until you're sure.
Yes, yes.
You know?
Yeah, and we did make the mistake sometimes of recording a little bit too early, and then we tried to adjust afterwards and be like, okay, well, did every single writer sign off on all of this stuff? And are we ready to record and bring it to? It was a little bit easier. One of the things that I think we jumped into voice recording earlier, where we recorded the first chapter, beyond the fact that we needed to deliver a demo, was that I really wanted the writers to hear the performers' voices as early as possible. So that, in fact, we actually cast the voice actors before any dialogue was written. And so just to kind of understand the kind of performers, the timbre of their voice, and kind of also shape the character around the timbre of their voice as well. So that was something that, at least for writers, we liked that kind of constraint. I don't know if I answered your question on the budgeting side exactly.
Yeah, it seems like there was a lot to start to establish, and then kind of maybe a dearth, and then.
Yeah, I think we took a straight up like upfront cost, paying for the fact that like maybe we recorded some lines too early in chapter 1. But I think what was worth it was that the writers really got used to writing for these voices earlier, and that helped us way down the line, because like around chapter 3-ish of the game, we were starting to we're very confident with being able to like, okay, I think this line is ready to be recorded. So yeah.
Great. Love it. Thanks, man.
Are there any questions upstairs?
Doesn't look like it.
Hi. I'm just curious, as you're going through production, it sounds like you kind of wrote the game sort of as you were making it. Does that that correct?
Yeah.
Would you find you were kind of stuck with maybe decisions you'd made earlier on? Like say if you improvised something, like came up with something kind of novel for a later part of the game, would you then sometimes have to go back to earlier parts of the game and make changes, or were you kind of like keeping that firm?
Yes, we did. And I think, maybe that's that's a good question, because there's an interesting part of the process maybe here I missed, where is that as we review chapters going forward, we also would go back and review chapters that we had and kind of always play the game in succession, like fully in a review. So there are times where opportunities arise later on where we're like, oh, this character is becoming more important, and we didn't really understand that as we were doing it, and then we would backtrack and backfill that character throughout the game. For anybody who's played the game, the second half of the game, there's a lot of characters that stuck around, and then they were doing certain roles that we didn't fully understand until we did them, and then we did backfill some of those character stories in the first half of the game.
Thank you.
Which one? I guess I'll go for you on the right here.
So this process, I feel like, is lightning in a bottle. It either goes really well as everything cascades forward and you get faster and faster and hit your pace, or it could go very wrong. And I'm curious what specific things went wrong that you were able to correct for, if that happened.
That's a really interesting question. Now I have to think back. Trying to think of a good example, because there were definitely things that went wrong, for sure, right? As is any kind of process of making anything. I think sometimes, one of the difficulties of, and I said this earlier as part of the device process, and this happens in our theater device processes as well, when you're dead in the middle of it, it's almost impossible to understand what's going on. And that's kind of where I think we want to create better infrastructures in the future to help us mitigate that middle part. Like in theater, we just kind of stomached it. I don't know why, we just kind of push through it and keep working. But obviously, making a game is a much longer cycle of creation than, say, making a theater piece that maybe a couple of months that you spend working on it. So I think sometimes you do have writers crisscrossing their approach on characters because they didn't 100% understand, or they're not 100% visible to what is being written concurrently with them. And that is difficult. I don't know exactly, obviously we could meet and read all the stuff, but still, because it's such an active and live process, those things can happen. And there's a larger question in my mind where it's okay, maybe those things should just be allowed to happen, and then we kind of come back and take a look at all the stuff, or is there really early ways that we can identify that and mitigate it? I'm sorry, I wish I had a better, I want to guarantee, I do want to say that yeah, definitely things went wrong, right? And it is it's not a flawless process or anything like that. Obviously, it's very, can be risky. But I'm blanking right now on maybe a really good example, but I think there's one that exists, I'm sure. Oh, okay, last question.
Just go with you.
Carrying on from that question, for your rules for engagement, I understand that they were dynamically changing as you went through the process. Were there any points of contention or key rules that had to be maintained throughout the process?
One of the key rules was that we were always trying to, I was saying, make sure that the player was doing, whatever the player was doing made sense diegetically. That was just a rule that we had decided we wanted to follow through with. And often some of the things that writers would pitch would be very difficult to transform into something that allowed that to happen. So we would often have to mutate what they had pitched to try and stay along those constraints. I don't know if I 100%. That was definitely one rule that we tried to adhere to the entire time. Of course, there's also like lore rules that we threw out the window for hot drafts, but then reintroduced in the rewrites and tried to make sure that everything made sense with pre-established kind of understanding of what the world would be. I guess as one of the lead writers, it was always that we would try to not betray the audience trust about the rules that we did set out. And so if we were making something a rule, we would have to stick to it, even if we were going off on hot drafting eventually and then coming back and re-implementing it somehow that worked. Again, I don't 100% know if I answered your question though, but thank you for your question. I think that's it. Thank you.